Hi, welcome back to the science of COVID-19 for the non-scientist. In this video, I want to talk about the biology of the coronavirus. One fascinating thing about viruses is just how tiny they are. So here's a visual to help us understand that. 1 micron is 1,000th of a millimeter. Now, 40 microns is about the biggest thing that we can see with our naked eye, meaning without a microscope. So in this blue circle here, I've created this small black dot. So just for reference, let's pretend that that is 40 microns. That is the smallest thing that we can see without a microscope. Now a white blood cell, which is our cells that fight bacteria and viruses, are about 25 microns. So a little bit more than half of the biggest thing that we can see. Sorry, the smallest thing that we can see. And about a third of the size of a white blood cell is a red blood cell, about 8 microns. Red blood cells carry the oxygen to the different organs in our body. A light dust particle is about 1 micron, and then about a third of a micron is the coronavirus. So it is absolutely tiny. So what is a virus anyway, besides being something that's extremely small? Well, if you look at this diagram here, a virus is essentially a protein container that contains a little bit of DNA or RNA. In the coronavirus, it's actually RNA. And whether it's DNA or RNA, it carries the instructions for how to make more virus particles. A cell from us, from a mammal, in contrast, is a lot more complicated. It contains all of this other stuff in there. And all of this stuff is important because what it does is it converts or it basically reads the DNA and figures out the instructions that are contained in the DNA to be able to make proteins. And proteins are important because they make up all of life. Our cells, our bodies, bones, muscles, everything is made up of protein. And the DNA tells the body how to make those proteins. Now, if you notice, the virus doesn't have all of this other stuff inside of it. So how does it make more of itself? How does it make these proteins from its DNA or RNA? The short answer is it basically hijacks our cells. It enters our cells and then uses all of our stuff to make more of itself. So this is an image of the coronavirus. This is, probably most of you have seen this. This is an artist rendition of it from the Centers for Disease Control. If you actually take the virus and cut a very thin slice of it and put it under a very high-powered microscope, this is what you'll see. You'll see the virus here with all these little things sticking out. These things sticking out are proteins, and in particular, these red proteins, which are known as spike proteins. Okay. These spike proteins are extremely important for the virus because that is the protein that interacts with our cells. The spike protein basically attaches to receptors on our cells, and that's how the virus gets into our cells. And the importance of the spike protein is underscored by the fact that a lot of the vaccines that are being developed today target this spike protein. If we can make antibodies against this spike protein, we can block it from binding to our cells and prevent the virus from getting into our cells. That way, even if a few virus particles get into our body, they won't be able to get into our actual lung cells or other nasal epithelial cells, which I'll get into in a moment. They won't be able to replicate and make more of themselves. And thus we will be protected from an infection. So what does the virus do? Here's our cell. Here is a little virus particle. And given the size difference between viruses and us, or our cells rather, it's usually the case that there are many virus particles trying to get into our cells at the same time. And what these virus particles do is they bind to this receptor called ACE2, which is a protein in our own body that we need, but that the virus has sort of exploited. And it binds to this protein, and then it injects its DNA or RNA into our cells. Once it gets into our cells, once this DNA or RNA is inside our cell, it basically uses, the virus uses all of our machinery, all of our proteins inside of the cell to make more of itself, make, hundreds and hundreds of copies of itself that then bud out and go on to infect other cells. So not only does it, hijack our cells, but while it's replicating and making more copies of itself, our cell can't really do its normal job because all of its energy is being used to make more virus particles. Now, where is this ACE2 receptor anyway? So there was a large scientific group a few months ago that tried to look at where in our bodies is this receptor? Where is the virus getting into our body? And they took healthy tissue from human donors. These were actually, if I remember correctly, people that were donating their lungs for lung transplantation. And then these lungs, for whatever reason, couldn't be used. And so they were able to, with permission, use some of that extra tissue for these experiments. So, and all the stuff in the blue is the normal human tissue that's been stained with a dye so that we can see it. And on the top is tissue from the nose, then trachea, then bronchial, and then alveoli. And this diagram here shows you where these tissues come from. So here's the one in the nose, we breathe in, then the air goes into our trachea, and then into these bronchioles, okay, that go into each lung. And then at the end of them are these little air sacs called alveoli, where the oxygen and carbon dioxide actually exchange. So the oxygen from the air goes into our blood, and then the carbon dioxide from the waste products in our body go out through the lungs back into the air, and we breathe out that carbon dioxide. So they took tissue from each of these areas, and then they used a special stain from, special stain to these two receptors, ACE2, which we just mentioned, and then this other receptor, TMPRSS2, which is sort of a helper receptor. The virus also needs that receptor to get in properly into the cells. And what they did is they looked at the pink stain to see where are these receptors located. And as you can see, there's a lot relatively in the nose, and then less in the trachea, less in the bronchioles, and very few receptors in the alveoli. So what these scientists concluded was that when we breathe in these virus particles, the virus gets into our body through our nose tissue, and then we sort of swallow it down into our lungs. We aspirate it into our lungs, where it can then start a lung infection. So I mentioned that ACE2 is really important for our body. It would be nice if somehow we could just block all of the ACE2 receptors in our body so that the virus couldn't access it, and then we wouldn't have to worry about getting infected. The problem is that this ACE2 receptor is really important for our normal functioning. It's required for preventing heart disease and high blood pressure. And amazingly, it's found almost everywhere in our body, in our brain, in our lungs, in our blood cells, in our liver, in our gut, kidneys, heart, eyes. And so the ACE2 receptor is really important for our body in multiple places. And it's just really unfortunate that this virus has been able to evolve so that it can use the ACE2 receptor to wreak havoc within our bodies. This is a slide showing you what happens when the virus indeed does get into our lungs. So this is unfortunately from an autopsy. This individual did not survive the infection. The first panel here is a stain of a piece of or part of the lung, just to show you what the lung architecture looks like. This panel doesn't have a stain on it that shows you with the SARS-CoV-2, it's actually a negative control. This is a stain or a section of lung with a stain for the virus, SARS-CoV-2. So everything that's pink here and that's magnified here is actual virus. So you can just see how this virus has taken over this huge, or this, piece of the lung here. And you can imagine that everywhere that you see virus is probably an area where the lung tissue itself is becoming damaged, not only because the virus is actively replicating inside of those cells, but because the presence of the virus is drawing in a lot of immune cells that are causing inflammation and edema or water in the lungs, making it even more and more difficult for the person to breathe. So this was a brief overview of some of the biology of the coronavirus. In the next video, we'll look at some of the immune responses to the virus.